So I just talked about the five main features of emerging adulthood. And overall, some of you may be thinking that these sound kind of negative or maybe not negative, but stressful. And maybe it sounds like a difficult time. So I wanted to present more data for you, and this data is coming from 2013, so still not 2019 data, but not super old either, within the last 10 years. So there was a national survey done of 18 to 29-year-olds. This was from 2012, but the data was written up a little bit later after that. And 56% of these individuals who would be in the emerging adulthood period of life agreed with the statements the statement I feel anxious or I often feel anxious. And 32% agree with the statement I often feel depressed. So you see that they are saying this is a subjective sense of some negative mental health issues here, and maybe it's not to the level of a diagnosis, but they're feeling those symptoms, these internalizing symptoms. But at the same time, the same group of individuals, 83% of them agreed with the statement, "This time of my life is fun and exciting." So how do we make sense of that? How do we make sense of a finding that I'm anxious quite often? I might feel depressed too, but also my life is going pretty well and this is fun and exciting. This is a time of transition and change, and any time that we are going through a transition or change, certainly can be stressful. You guys might be feeling this right now as we're, having transition into distance learning, but just a time of unknowing. We don't know when we're going to be able to hang out with people in person again. But at the same time, maybe you're enjoying the alone time or the time that you get to work on homework without distractions or the time that you get to read books for pleasure or watch TV. So that's just one example of a time where, yeah, transitions are stressful, but they could also be fun and exciting. Um, there's also the argument that when we do see anxiety or depression, they may be more of a consequence of identity struggles that are just normal in this life stage anyway. So it doesn't mean that there's necessarily problems with going through emerging adulthood. It's just that we're, again, going back to this idea of transition. In our 20s, this is when we're most likely to find our enduring relationships. So, finding a person that you want to settle down with, whether that is to marry or not to marry. But there are lots of breakups and single periods before that. So, transitional time periods, times of change. There's lots of job change. This median 4 changes from 20 to 29 of how many jobs you're changing from, and periods of unemployment. And so these are just normal parts of being at this time period. So when we're talking about feeling anxious or feeling depressed and also trying to make sense of that with fun and excitement, this has to do with just transition and how that can be stressful, but also we often find better things to get involved with or relationships with people who suit us better or jobs that suit us better. So it can be both. It can be difficult, it can be stressful, but it also could be a time of limitless possibilities. And that's what the data says. If we look at the data broadly, not just looking at that sample, even though that was nationally representative sample from the last slide, in general, this time period is more positive, and other people outside looking in may seem to think, it's a time of floundering or stress, but individuals going through it tend to have more positive outcomes. And there's some research that shows that individuals who are trying to figure out who they are and focusing on themselves actually are less depressed and they're more positive and maybe are experiencing greater self-esteem. Some of the reasons that or arguments for why this may be the case is because of things that we've already talked about. They're actually, enjoying this time of self-focus, and it's a time of freedom. They might be free from these role obligations or restraints, not having to jump into certain careers or certain relationships. And also they're working towards self-sufficiency, and this can feel pretty good to meet these milestones like, wow, I have gotten my, my big girl job now, or wow, I'm in this successful relationship, or I found this living arrangement that really seems to suit me, and I'm feeling more and more like an adult. Maybe you're not telling yourself that, but we do celebrate those achievements. When you first perhaps buy your own car, it feels definitely like your own, achievement. This towards self-sufficiency. The other thing has to do with just cognitive development, that we are still developing in terms of how we think, where we talked about the prefrontal cortex, but this growing cognitive maturity that allows us to understand ourselves and other people better. And when we're able to do that, understanding ourselves and understanding other people, this leads to good outcomes, this wisdom of ourselves and other people. So there's multiple reasons. These are just some of the arguments made, but as a whole, this time period is associated with more positive outcomes than negative outcomes when we look at the data broadly. Going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this lecture and the idea of, is this its own unique time period in the lifespan? People who argue that it's not argue that because it's not universal. And what do they mean by that? They mean that, like, does everybody experience all five features all around the world? Or is there a lot of variation? And in short, we know that emerging adulthood is not universal. Similarly, our experience of adolescence is not universal. Yes, we're all going through biological, cognitive, and social changes, but those look quite different from person to person. When we look at the data for universality, we see that there are many individuals in the Western world or in more affluent countries that seem to have individuals going through these five main features or this time period. So people from the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and some of the affluent countries in Europe. Does this mean that every single person within those countries has, these experiences of these five main features? No, that's not true either. But we see that this is exceedingly common. We tend to see it more in the cultures that essentially allow us to postpone adult roles. So places that we have parents and society that are telling us, you know what, you need to explore, you need to figure out what you want to do and who you want to be and who you want to be with. So in the US, we're going to talk more about this in lectures to come, but the age in which women are getting married is about 25, actually maybe even a little bit older than that in more recent data, 27 in males. Over 60% of individuals are attending some college, meaning that they're not jumping into adult roles or adult jobs. And so the cultures that are allowing us to kind of dabble and figure out who we want to be are more likely to be those that are endorsing this idea of emerging adulthood broadly, because you are able to focus on yourself and to think about your identity. As the world becomes more industrialized and more globalized, we see evidence of emerging adulthood in even growing countries and in third world countries. Emerging adulthood is increasingly more common, but it's not universal. That means that there are lots of people who may be jumping straight from adolescence into adulthood, and maybe not even straight from adolescence like 18 graduating high school, but even earlier than that. So more similar to times of the past where individuals were again jumping into those adult roles, getting married young, having children young. But again, more common as we are going through time to have individuals experiencing these five main features. I've already mentioned this too, but this is also an argument for universality, this idea of the variability with regard to the dimensions. So just broadly, those five main features, maybe some of those you have figured out and others you don't. you would still answer yes and no to that question of do you feel like an adult? As one example that I've already mentioned, though, we may have different degrees of commitment to work, romantic lives, and in our residential arrangements. So we might have some of that figured out, but not all. But again, those individuals who may have some stuff figured out and not others may still say, do I feel like an adult? In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. So, this is our lecture on emerging adulthood. Whether or not you believe it's its own time period in the lifespan, there is some evidence that at least some people are experiencing something in between. Can we call it its own thing right now? Do we have enough evidence to do that? Um, it depends on who you talk to. There's not one right answer. I, for one, am a supporter of this idea because I do see it as something that, you are more independent, but not completely independent. Or you have some stuff figured out, but not everything. And we just need to do more research, particularly on, let's say, younger individuals, those who are members of Gen Z, to see what this looks like today. And the next topic we have, I believe, is early adult roles, and we'll see about how again the transition from emerging adulthood to early adulthood, what that looks like.